Thanks, Mike. As Mike says, I'm Adam Davey, analyst within Oil and Gas UK, and I'm going to talk you through some of the highlights from this year's activity survey. So a bit of background to start with. The survey is done annually, and we gather data primarily from the operators themselves, and we cover every company with offshore operations in the UKCS. So if you like, it's a 100% view of the basin. Now, I'm going to start by showing this infographic. And what the headlines show is there's a major contrast in the UKCS at the moment. This contrast is seen across the whole petroleum cycle. I'm going to look at exploration and appraisal activity, investment, operations and production, all the way through to decommissioning. So, I'll start with the financials. We had record levels of capex in the UKCS in 2013 at £14.4 billion, and we expect it to remain at £13 billion this year. On the other hand, the cost of operating the basin has also been record. It cost £8.9 billion to operate in 2013, and we expect this to increase to £9.6 billion next year. The production decline has slowed significantly after some particularly bad years, and we believe the future is brighter, which I'll come on to shortly. There has been a fall in the sanctioned reserves base, but 40% of production will come from new developments by the year 2018. It shows that there's a lot there in the tank waiting to come on stream. There are some major initiatives in place to improve production efficiency, step up exploration, increase recovery, and rejuvenate some of the more mature regions of the UKCS. So I'm going to start by showing you some information on prices. I think we'd probably all agree that oil prices provided quite an inviting backdrop for investors over the last 3 or 4 years. The thing that really strikes me about this graph is the unusual stability we've had in oil price recently. The oil price has actually averaged $111, $112 and $109 per barrel in the last 3 years, and it's very rarely moved outside the $100 to $120 bracket. Like all free markets, price is determined by supply and demand, so what's been keeping price high? Well, some disruption of supply in North Africa, particularly Libya, and also the recovering global demand in the wake of the 2008 recession. One more thing before I move on from this slide is the gas price depicted by the red line has been climbing slowly but steadily over the last 3 years, and actually over the course of 2013 traded at 56% of Brent price. This is the highest relative to the Brent price since 2008. Now, every oil and gas province in the world needs to start with some reserves and resources, and luckily we've got some in the UK. I'm going to talk you through how this picture has changed over the last 12 months. So we'll start with the high-level stuff. The total reserve picture shows 10.7 billion BOE is in company plans this year. This compares to 11.4 billion last year. So clearly there's a big future for the UKCS. If we stand on the 1st of January 2013, we believe we had 7.1 billion BOE in sanctioned reserves, and this has fallen to 6.6 billion as I'm standing here this year. So why has that happened? Well, first of all, we produced slightly more barrels than we sanctioned. So we produced 520 million BOE last year, which is obviously good news. We sanctioned 460 million BOE, which largely came from the Mariner and Kraken approvals. On the downside, there has been some project cancellation this year, most notably Shell publicly cancelled their Fram project, which was in as a sanctioned reserve, and there's been some reservoir reappraisal. Most significantly though, some cost increases, which I'll talk about in more detail later, have led to economic life of many fields in the UKCS shortening, and we're losing barrels as a result of that. It's not too late to resolve this, and this situation can be turned around. If we move on from the 6.6 billion that's sanctioned, what have we got on top of that? Well, we've got 2.7 billion that you can see there in probable reserves, taking us to a greater than P50 number of 9.4 billion BOE. And then additionally, we've got 1.3 billion in BOE, which companies consider possible. I'd like to just draw your attention to the orange chunks you see on that graph, which represent the brownfield reserves. And they've notably increased by 25% over the last 12 months. This is largely a result of projects being made commercial as a result of the brownfield allowance, and also a number of large fields coming into phase 2 or 3 of development. We actually currently have 109 potential brownfield projects in our survey. So it's all good talking about this, but how can we actually improve this picture? Well, for a start, we can add to the probable and possible reserves through exploration and appraisal activity, which is crucial. Secondly, we can mature new discoveries or make previous discoveries commercial. There's been a lot of evidence of that in the UKCS over the last 5 or 10 years, with projects being approved that were discovered maybe 5, 10, 15 or 20 years ago. This delivers the probable and possible reserves right through the cycle to sanction. We also need to improve recovery from existing fields through things like enhanced oil recovery techniques. And everything I've just talked about will only be done effectively if there is strong cost management in place. Now, if we look at the reserve picture more regionally, we can see on this graph here, the first thing that struck me when I looked at this was that all areas of the UKCS have at least 3 billion BOE of recoverable potential remaining. Clearly, the Southern Gas Basin is most developed, and the west of Shetland is known as the frontier region of the UKCS. And in fact, what this graph shows is, for the west of Shetland, less than 5% of the total potential of the area is currently in production. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Action is needed across the whole business cycle if recovery is going to be maximised in the UKCS, and this clearly won't happen on its own. So, there are 4 key areas where I think we can help ourselves here. Production efficiency must improve to maximise recovery from existing assets. So that's these bottom 2 grey and black sections. Probable and possible reserves must be reappraised in light of technological improvements to bring them through to sanction. So that deals with the blue and the green parts. Enhanced oil recovery techniques must be applied to recover additional reserves from existing assets. So these are the potential additional resources depicted by the purple blocks. And then finally the beige blocks, which I'm not sure if you can see too well up there. But if exploration must be more successful than it is today if we are to deliver the amount of yet to find resource you can see behind me there. It's not just the industry that needs to work hard on this. The regulator and Her Majesty's Treasury must play their role by collaborating with industry to provide the right regulatory and fiscal environment to allow all of these things to happen. To put it into a bit of context for you, annual production in 2013 was about 8% of our proven reserve base, and that proven reserve base in turn is only about a third of our estimated total recoverable resource base. So there's a whole load of resource left to play for in the UK. So now I'm going to come on to talk about exploration drilling. The graph behind me shows that there's typically a very strong correlation between oil price and exploration activity. Exploration activity is actually one of the first activities to suffer from a change in market conditions, whether they be fiscal or price related. And I've taken the liberty of marking some fiscal changes on this diagram, and I think it's quite clear to see that exploration activity is extremely responsive to fiscal shocks. Now, when the financial crisis occurred late in 2008, there seems to have been a decoupling of this relationship. Since when, exploration has not recovered, as you can see by the blue line sort of fading away towards 2013, whereas the red line showing oil prices stay very high. Now, I'll take a look at exploration and appraisal in a bit more detail, and what this slide actually shows is Oil and Gas UK's P50 forecast for E&A activity, i.e. all those wells that companies say have a greater than 50% chance of going ahead. And it also shows 10 years of history. So there's been a notable step down in activity since 2008, as I mentioned. Between 2005 and 2008, we were drilling 91 E&A wells per year. Since 2009, we've been drilling 53 per year. So activity has almost halved over that relatively short period. If we look at 2013 specifically, we drilled 15 exploration wells and 29 appraisal wells, which was well below what we forecast 12 months ago and isn't really enough. More alarmingly, we only discovered 80 million BOE of recoverable reserves from that activity, and around half of this actually appears uncommercial currently. The Central North Sea dominated exploration drilling last year, and it accounted for 10 of the 15 wells. A lot of operators told us that they cancelled or postponed drilling activity last year, and they cited 3 key reasons. Lack of affordable rig availability accounted for almost 40% of the cancelled wells. Lack of access to finance, both internally, large companies fighting for capital against other provinces, and externally, those smaller companies that are forced to go to market for finance. And also, bad weather and well complexity caused further delays. We are forecasting that 36 wells will be drilled in 2014, although we believe the dynamic may shift slightly towards exploration, 25 of them being E wells and 11 being A wells. It's interesting to note that actually half of these wells were postponed from 2013, which does show this idea of a backlog in drilling in the UKCS waiting to happen, but this won't happen if the right resources aren't in place. The Exploration Task Force, through Pilot, are currently looking at what can be done to improve exploration activity in the UK. So it would be quite silly to talk about E&A without actually looking at the rig market a bit. Rig costs clearly are a big part of drilling. This picture here does exclude platform-based drilling where costs are unavailable, but a large number of rigs have been recommissioned in this area. What it does show, there were 39 rigs in the UK at the end of 2013, so 20 jackups and 19 semi-submersibles. and companies consistently tell us that rigs are not available at the right cost or specification relative to the prospectivity now available in the UKCS. The semi-submersible day rate you can see depicted by the orange line has almost doubled since 2011, and the jack-up day rate has risen by around 60% over the same time. So to put that into some kind of context, if you're standing with a prospect in 2011 and deciding whether to drill it, if you've got that same prospect now in 2013, the expected monetary value from drilling that well is clearly going to be materially damaged simply because the day rate of the equipment you need to use to drill it has gone up significantly. Such cost increases have been a major deterrent to exploration activity over the last 2 years. And given the opportunities available in the UK, another problem is that rigs are often required on much shorter contracts than in other places such as Norway or West Africa, where they have the prospectivity to lease a rig for 6, 7, 8, 9 or maybe even 10 years, whereas in the UK they're usually only required for 1, 2 or 3 years. So let's talk about expenditure. This picture behind me now shows total expenditure on the UKCS since 2003. It actually shows you the spend in money of the day, but I can assure you if I adjusted this for inflation, which I have done, 2013 spend is comfortably the highest on record still. And I think there's been a clear step up in activity since 2011. I'm going to go on to talk about each element of expenditure in more detail in a moment, but I'll run you through a few numbers of the 4 key areas. So capital investment, it's risen significantly over the last 2 years as a result of a number of large investments. Operating costs, after being relatively flat and well controlled for most of the decade, have actually increased by 25% over the last 2 years. The depressed level of E&A activity I talked to you about doesn't seem to have affected spend, and this is because those wells that have been drilled have often been expensive and subject to time and cost overruns. And as a result of the mature basin we're in, we've drilled all the things that are easy, so we're now drilling the more technically challenging wells. And I've also included decommissioning on this, the purple sliver, which is actually now beginning to happen in the UKCS. Total spend was almost £1 billion in 2013, and that actually accounts for 3.5% of total expenditure. Such is the level of expenditure on the UKCS at the moment. It's roughly equal to the level of post-tax revenue generated from the basin. So that says that the basin didn't actually generate any free cash in 2013. Clearly this is not sustainable over the long term, and indeed, if I was to extend this picture further as a forecast, we do see the situation easing in the future as some big developments come into production. Now, these big developments coming into production I'm talking about, you'll often have heard myself or my colleagues talking about a wave of projects that have been sustaining capital investment over the first half of this decade. And the projects you see on the screen behind me are that wave. Over the last 4 years, companies have sanctioned more than 50 new projects, as well as a number of large redevelopments, which will invest over £35 billion in the UKCS, and hopefully deliver over 3 billion BOE over time. 5 of the projects you see behind me there are actually multi-billion pound investments, where the majority of CapEx is not invested over a 1 to 2 year period, but a 3 to 5 year period. There are a couple of 50 to 100 million BOE fields in here, but the majority of it is a raft of small fields that are less than 50 million BOE in size. That's typical of a development in the UKCS today. On top of this, which you can't see from this picture, is the constant stream of brownfield activity, much of which has been enabled by the brownfield allowance. And once this investment cycle is over and these projects are all on stream and there's no further investment in them, there is much less certainty about what will be the next wave of projects. So whoever's standing here delivering the activity survey in 4 years' time, if they were to show this slide replicated, which projects will be there? That's what we need to ensure. We need to work hard to get more large projects approved and continue the constant stream of small and brownfield investments that are going on in the UKCS to avoid a collapse in investment towards the end of the decade. Now I'll take a more detailed look at capital investment. Capital investment was at a record level, £14.4 billion in 2013, and we expect it to remain over £10 billion per year until 2015 because of the investment in this wave of large projects. If more big developments aren't approved, this diagram shows that it could tail off significantly towards the end of the decade. And it's interesting to note, I've marked the allowances on this picture, and over 50% of investment today is in fields in receipt of a field allowance. It's probably worth me mentioning that whilst this is a P50 outlook, investment in ultra high pressure, high temperature fields are not certain at this stage, and they will depend on the right shape of field allowance being negotiated. Industry and government are currently consulting on this. It's very, very notable that when we get towards sort of 2016, 17 and 18, very little investment is anticipated to happen without a field allowance. Now that tells me two things. One, yes, field allowances are very successful in incentivising investment, but two, very little investment can actually go ahead at a marginal tax rate of 62 or 81%. It is important to remember when talking about field allowances that they only relieve part of the tax bill, the supplementary charge. Each field will pay a minimum of 30% corporation tax on profits earned, and indeed, after 5 years, when the allowance has been used, the field will go back to paying the full rate of tax, whether it be 62% or 81%, depending on whether it's a PRT pay. This slide here shows you the efficiency of capital in the UKCS. It essentially shows you the bang you get for your buck. With continued high demand for supply chain services, capital cost pressures have risen exponentially over the last decade. What this graph actually shows you is that every £1 being considered for investment in 2013 is expected to yield 5 times less in production than that same pound in 2002. Of course, there has been general inflation in the UK over the period, but it's been nowhere near on the scale you see in this picture. This is actually an inverted view of unit development costs, really. So unit development costs are now £13.50 per BOE. This compares to around £3 per BOE 10 years ago. The relatively flat capital efficiency in 2013, we believe, could indicate that investors actually have no further appetite for developments any more expensive than you see those currently available on the UKCS. And indeed, we believe they may have hit a ceiling in terms of the total amount they are willing to pay to develop each unit of production. So if we go to look at the next component of expenditure, operating costs, this is a somewhat worrying picture. Generally, when we've seen the activity survey delivered in years gone by, we've been talking about how well operating costs have been controlled over the life of this industry. And even from 2000 to 2010, operating costs were fairly flat after adjusting for inflation. This hasn't been the case for the last 3 years. The cost of operating the UKCS was £7 billion in 2011. It was £7.7 billion in 2012. It was £8.9 billion in 2013. And we expect it to be £9.6 billion in 2014. These year-on-year step change increases are absolutely not sustainable, and we believe operating costs must flatten over the latter half of the decade. When we put this in context of the production decline we've been seeing, these increases become all the more alarming. We paid 15.5% more to operate the basin in 2013 compared to 2012, and that's despite producing 8% less. This results in operating cost increases of 25%, and the average barrel now costs £17 to operate rather than £13.50 as we saw last year. I'll just draw your attention to the figure in the foreground showing the red and blue bars. That shows the number of projects operating at more than £30 per BOE has doubled over the last 12 months. And I think you can all see the general shift to the right there for the red bars compared to the blue is quite clear. It is worth noting, after a depressing start to this slide, that more than 50 fields in the UK do still operate at less than £10 per BOE. And in fact, if you take a median average rather than a mean, you would come to a UOC of just under £11 per BOE, significantly lower than the £17 per BOE mean average. The mean is being pushed higher by the growing number of fields that are very expensive to operate. These are the fields that are of particular concern. The economic life of these fields is shortening, as we saw in the reserve picture. They will face premature decommissioning, stranding reserves if this problem cannot be addressed. If assets, and potentially even hubs, are prematurely decommissioned, the loss of infrastructure could be irreparably damaging to the long-term future of the UKCS. Looking at operating costs in the near term will be a priority for this industry. Now, I alluded to production picking up earlier in the infographic slide, and many of you may be thinking, hang on a minute, we've had declining production now for 13 consecutive years in the UKCS, and this guy's telling me that production is going to increase or stay flat in 2014. So I feel that I should show you why I believe this may be the case. So let's start with 2013. Production averaged 1.43 million BOE per day, which represented an 8% decline from 2012. Liquids fell by 9% and gas fell by 6%. This was better than we expected at the halfway stage of the year, and in fact the overall decline has been 15% per year since 2010, so the rate of decline did slow significantly last year. The summer of 2013 was not as dominated by shutdowns as the previous 3 years, and in fact the second half of the year's production was very encouraging, particularly Q4. Production rose consistently and steadily from August through to December, and we actually ended the year producing roughly the same as we did at the start of the year. So when I stand here now talking about what we may produce in 2014, we're starting from the same place as we were last year. which is a big bonus and something you don't normally see. We do believe production could increase to up to 1.5 million BOE per day in 2014. This is down to a number of things. Firstly, and probably most crucially, improved performance from the currently producing fields. The early signs from the Production Efficiency Task Force show that production efficiency is improving, and we need this to continue. There are also some crucial fields in the UKCS restarting or improving performance in 2014. So this is things like Elgin Franklin, which have been not at full capacity over the last few months, or longer than that even, and the BP-operated Rum field, which is likely to come back into production this year at some stage after the Iranian sanctions were lifted. We also have increased production from 2013 startups, which is the most significant reason that I believe production could increase. If we take the three largest fields that came on stream last year, Jasmine, Brer and Huntingdon, we expect those three fields alone to contribute 10% of total UK production in 2014. That shows you how significant they are when they have a full year of production. There are also those fields we expect to start up during the course of this year. A number of large fields are expected to come on stream in 2014, and these will also add to the existing base. One of the most notable things when I conducted this activity survey and I spoke to operators was that only a handful of operators were actually not predicting an upturn in production in 2014. This is very, very unusual, but extremely encouraging for a mature basin. And the message really here is that's easy to talk about, but now we've got to get the job done and actually deliver these barrels. So if I take a slightly longer term view and look beyond 2014 for production, what you see behind me here is the forecast widening. This is understandable and reflects increasing uncertainties towards the end of the decade. The wave of projects I keep referring to earlier will have a big impact on production when they come on stream. And in fact, by 2018, 40% of production is expected to come from fields that are new, i.e. they're not on stream today. The impact of this new production makes it hard to not see production picking up at some point this decade. And our central case actually indicates that production will rise gradually and reach almost 1.7 million BOE per day by 2017. As I said with investment, the forecast beyond the end of this decade is far less certain. The key thing is that we don't let this forecast upturn just fade away. If this production upturn is to be sustained, it is crucial that many of the 43 new fields and 109 brownfield opportunities that are reported to us in company plans that are yet to secure final investment decision are brought into development. To give you some idea of the size on offer here, 10 of those fields on their own are greater than 100 million BOE in size. If we can get just those 10 fields on stream, that's an extra billion barrels that we can recover from the UKCS. The work of the Production Efficiency Task Force will continue to be crucial as they strive to get production efficiency back to 80%. We must also work hard to improve the current recovery factor of the UKCS, which is 46% for fields. We need to improve this if we're to maximise recovery from existing assets. Now, I've included a slide on decommissioning this year, which we haven't done in the past. And I actually said to a colleague that decommissioning is creeping up on us. And he turned around to me and said, creeping up on us? This must be the only industry where we can talk about spend creeping up on us when it's almost £1 billion per year. But that is actually the case for 2013. And the £1 billion mark is expected to be broken for the first time this year. We believe that decommissioning activity will average around £1.3 billion per year over the remainder of the decade. Whilst the outlook to 2040 is clearly much less certain, it has routinely risen year on year, which reflects the uncertainties around the true cost of decommissioning, which is really down to a lack of experience in this area. We actually now forecast that decommissioning expenditure will be just over £40 billion by 2040, 37 billion of which comes from existing assets. So that doesn't include all the yet to find potential that I alluded to when I was talking about reserves. Now, I can't really talk about decommissioning without mentioning the decommissioning relief deeds and the hard work that went into them over the last 2 years. DRD contracts between industry and government do guarantee tax relief on decommissioning costs. They are likely to delay the decommissioning of a number of fields and free up capital investment which could be spent elsewhere in the basin. However, I do want to say that due to the timing of this survey, so the request was sent out to operators in September, when the DRDs were first being signed, we could never expect to see any evidence of the impact of DRDs in this activity survey, but hopefully it's something we will see in the future. As with any challenge comes an opportunity, and this decommissioning represents a great one. We have the chance here to develop a world-class supply chain in the UKCS in this area, and we could continue to export their capabilities for many years to come once there is no more production in the UKCS. Now, we're going to say a few slides on the wood review here, and it would be silly for me to do this when Mike Tolan was on the review panel, so I'll hand over to him now to wrap things up.
Adam, thank you very much indeed. An excellent presentation. I should just stay there for now. As Adam mentioned, for the last 6 months I've been involved with Surrey Wood on what's become known as a wood review. The long title was a much less attractive one to use. Finding that the review was launched on Monday and really built on what we'd talked about in the interim report, which is we need a new mindset. And as Adam has shown, the challenges for our basin at the minute are we need to work much more effectively to get the next wave of production out of the North Sea. It will not come for easy, and it needs to come with government, the Treasury, DEC, and DEC with the new regulator to be, and the industry working together to maximise economic recovery. And the focus has been that we come to the room with a new concept, a new attitude, and a new approach to really maximise recovery. And that we create a new regulator to do that at arm's length from DEC, at arm's length from government, so it is much more free and much more able to be passionate about maximising that recovery and to both challenge, support and encourage the industry to do that. And that the regulator really work to implement a range of strategies that you'll see in the report to try and promote recovery. And those, I think, are very much aligned with the findings of our activity survey and the work that Adam and indeed Lindsay will show you in a minute or two. Classic of these sort of things were the pictures that we see. They're curiously out of focus on that. Trust me, they're really in focus in the report itself if you ever get to look at it. Of things like the Bray area, where we have a massive complex of platforms, and the Bray area recovered something like 1.3 billion barrels over the life of those fields over the last nearly 30 years. But only have something like 50 to 75 million barrels left in those original fields. So great past, a very difficult future, and part of a very complicated future. Something like 20 different fields tied in, connected, and going over and through the Bray area. And things like West Shetlands, where, as Adam shows, the provenance is still unfinished, and we have to work hard to work out what we're going to do West Shetlands, never mind what we're going to recover. Perhaps do you want to finish on the last slide, Adam, on this office?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess the key messages coming out of this are the UKCS has been 50 years in the making. The first production licence was awarded 50 years ago. It is supported by a world-class supply chain, and we have recovered 42 billion BOE to date. But what we need to do is ensure the future. There's 12 to 24 billion BOE we believe yet to come, and we need to really take on the blueprint laid out by Surrey and Wood in the Wood Review, the tripartite approach to the UKCS, if we're going to maximise recovery from this basin and secure the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam.
Thank you.